Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Gibson. I'm the founding executive producer and managing editor of Women in the World, the summit at Lincoln Center under the auspices of Tina Brown. For the past 10 years, I've been overseeing that summit. And before that, I was a longtime broadcast journalist at ABC News, primarily with Nightline with Ted Koppel, for whom I covered stories around the world, mostly global events and conflict. I want to dive in. Our focus today is on inequality and inequity. As you all know, you've just heard from the great Janet Yellen. Many other programs in this four-day symposium are overlapping into this issue of inequality and inequity, of course. What we will do, because there is a wonderful program on race, there's a program on democracy under siege, there is a conversation on journalists under siege, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. This program will look at other disciplines and other issues. And the experts in these disciplines, the top of the top of the top. We're so privileged, they're Yaleys and they're here with us, who will talk about how these issues intersect with inequality every single day. It is certainly the most, inequality and inequity has to be one of the most urgent issues of our time. So we're going to jump in. I'm going to jump in with asking each of our panelists to have a mission statement. We'll keep the bios short because they have amazing bios online, and I urge everyone to read those bios when this is over. You will be either inspired or humbled or both. I'm going to start with Joan Williams. Joan is the founding director of the Center for Work-Life Law. She's a distinguished professor at Hastings Law School. She's a legendary feminist scholar specializing in women in the workplace and on issues related to class division and inclusion. Joan, in a minute and a half, will you offer us your passion and your mission in this moment? Do we have Joan? All right, we're gonna move on to Abby. We'll go back to Joan when we have her. Abby, do you hear me?
Yes, yes, I do. Do you hear me?
Abby Disney. All right, Abby, I do hear you. Abby Disney, as many of you know, is making waves not only with her fight on behalf of the employees of the Disney company in terms of all kinds of rights, which Abby's going to talk about, but she's fighting for a new ethos among wealthiest Americans and among corporations. So Abby, I'm going to let you tell us in the next minute and a half what your passion is and what your mission in this moment is.
I guess I would say my passion is that I want to attack and potentially reset the very toxic narratives that we've been functioning on for quite a long time. I think we have a tendency to believe the narratives we were born with are necessary and eternal, and they are not. They are man-made, and we need to remake them every day.
We're going to move on to Linda Darling-Hammond. Linda, do you hear me?
I do. Can you hear me?
I hear you well. I hope we see you. Linda, you are the president of the California State Board of Education, an extremely important role, especially now. You're the founding president of the Learning Policy Institute. You're the professor emeritus at Stanford Graduate School of Education, and you're simply a legendary leader in education, as we all know. Talk about your passion and your mission in the next minute and a half.
Well, my passion is to get to a place where we offer an equitable and an empowering education for each and every child in this country. Despite our national rhetoric, we have a very unequal educational system. From the days when it was a crime to teach an enslaved person to read, all the way to the present with inequitable allocation of resources. We have a lot to do to get to a place where we can get every child educated as they should be.
All right, we're going to move on to Kate Walsh. Kate, with whom I overlapped at Yale and was honored to do so. Kate, do you hear me?
I sure can, Kyle. Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, I sure do. So Kate,
Great.
for more than a decade, you've been the head of the director of the pioneering Boston Medical Center, which I am just utterly fascinated by the more I learn about your center. Why don't you in the next minute and a half explain your passion and how it intersects with inequality in America?
Sure. So I'm proud to be the CEO of Boston Medical Center. We're a health system that is academic. We're an academic medical center, the primary teaching affiliate of the Boston University School of Medicine, but we disproportionately serve low-income patients. And we have been for decades and very proud of the work we do. We have the first therapeutic food pantry in the country. We invest in housing. We have a Graken Center for opioid addiction. You know, we're very high on the cool meter. We have a farm on the roof of one of our buildings to provide fresh fruits and vegetables to our patients. But what COVID illustrated for us was just the striking inequities in healthcare outcomes, even in our country, even in the United States, and particularly at a place like Boston Medical Center. 50% of the people we serve are Black or Latino. In COVID, that was 80%. So the convergence of COVID and Black Lives Matter have made me incredibly motivated to, in the last phase of my career, really focus on health equity or eliminating health inequities and disparities. You know, I thought we were doing a really good job at it, and I think there's a lot more we need to do, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, I can't wait to get to that with you. There's a couple of photos I've seen from your center that we'll talk about. Now, Krishanti Vignarajah. I'm a fan. You are the CEO of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. You're former policy advisor to Michelle Obama during the White House years. And you're the recent candidate for governor of Maryland, which I think we all bow to you for entering that race. The news continues to overwhelm us, Krish, on the refugees. Do you hear me, Krish, all right? I hope you do.
I can, yes.
Good. Why don't you talk about your passion and mission with regard to refugees and detainees and immigrants, please?
Sure. Yeah, so my passion and mission really relate to my role as president and CEO of LRS. Some of you may not have heard of LRS before. It's the largest faith-based national nonprofit dedicated to immigration and refugees. And if you've been following the news at all, you probably have a sense of how my job has been probably as difficult as it's ever been. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the unimaginable horrors of reports of hysterectomies performed on women in ICE detention, 9,000 kids summarily expelled at the border. It's especially painful for me because I know firsthand what America can do for refugees and immigrants. I also know what immigrants and refugees can do for America because this is a very personal issue to me. I came to the U.S. when I was 9 months old. My parents fled a civil war in Sri Lanka as it was kind of on the brink of the civil war. They came with no jobs, just a couple $100 in their pockets and two very young kids in their arms. We grew up in Baltimore, and it was the welcome of our neighbors that accepted us, not just as neighbors, but really as friends and then ultimately family, that I really do think helped my parents become Baltimore City educators and enable them to send their daughter to Yale and Oxford and Yale Law and eventually to the White House to serve as Michelle Obama's policy director. And for me, and hopefully you won't hear her during the session, but I have a 3-year-old daughter. And I know that my daughter's life will be easier because my own parents' lives were hard. And to me, that is the American dream. And I think my passion and mission are to keeping that dream alive.
Well, a lot of us met your daughter last week when we conversed together, and I'm a fan of hers as well. Joan Williams, can you hear me now, Joan?
I can hear you. For some reason, my camera doesn't work, but I'll just talk.
We're glad to have you, Joan. Joan, you are the founding director of the Center for Work-Life Law. You're a distinguished professor at Hastings Law School. You're a legendary feminist scholar. Women in the workplace is, of course, your big issue. Can you talk to us about your passion in the next minute and a half, and then we'll dive in deeper?
My passion really is that social inequality offends me, no matter what type. My first focus was on motherhood, because after the birth of my second child, I almost dropped out. And I thought, like, wow, if I can't do this, who can? So I founded the Center for Work-Life Law, and we helped invent the modern generation of workplace flexibility policies. And we also pioneered the law that protects mothers who at that time were being very openly discriminated against. And my second focus, which has also affected me personally, is on how racial and gender bias play out in organizations. So I have integrated huge areas of social science into 5 basic patterns that pinpoint how implicit bias plays out in professional workplaces. and developed a 10-minute climate survey that will show whether bias is being reported, where it's playing out, and its impact on outcome measures like belonging and intent to stay. And then we developed bias interrupters, because what we find again and again is that the experience of white men in the workplace is really very different from the experience of every other group. So our bias interrupters are evidence-based open source toolkits for interrupting bias at a structural level. And finally, I work also on social class. I wrote a 2017 book, which explains why Trump won, how anger against the professional managerial elite is driving American politics, and how culture wars are an expression of that. Race plays an important role, but class also does. They're not mutually exclusive. So that's what drives me.
You know, Joan, if you'll allow me, I think I'm just going to dive right in with you. We're going to have now for our audience some one-on-one moments with this incredible panel to dig a little deeper with each person's expertise with regard to inequity and inequality. So Joan, we're all mourning RBG this week. I don't think what anyone's politics are, the mourning is it's universal. What did she accomplish, Joan, RBG? And what did she leave undone?
Well, she accomplished a lot. Basically, she deconstructed the breadwinner homemaker model in government benefits, in divorce law, in government jobs. It was built into all of those things, and she convinced 9 men that was unconstitutional. She also brought over from Sweden a brand of feminism that is as committed to giving men access to caregiving roles as it is to giving women access to work. What she didn't do is address job discrimination against mothers. As I mentioned, when I founded Work Life Law in the late 1990s, mothers were being fired and told it was because they were mothers, and federal courts were saying that's not sex discrimination, that's discrimination based on gender, on parenthood, which is a gender-neutral category. So we documented that, in fact, bias against mothers is the strongest form of gender discrimination. And we used a Supreme Court case that was written by Justice Rehnquist. But the key language that Justice Rehnquist used came straight out of RGB's 1970s briefs. It said stereotypes about mothers, that mothers don't belong in the workplace, are matched pair with stereotypes that fathers don't belong in caregiving. Straight out of RBG.
Joan, working mothers. I want to get to this. We're tight on time, but how working mothers fared in this pandemic?
Okay. What I fear we're seeing is a generational wipeout of working mothers. We run a hotline for people who encounter discrimination based on caregiving responsibilities. We've had a 250% increase in calls to our hotlines, and we have helped tens of thousands of people who are getting kicked out of their jobs and having all kinds of problems due to COVID. We are just overwhelmed with calls. And I'll just give you one example. It was a father following RBG's example of focusing on what's happening to men as a matched pair to what's happening to women. This dad is a teacher's aide, and he's the primary caregiver for a toddler. So he had been working successfully from home during the pandemic, but then he was told, if you can believe this, that he would be fired if his child was ever in the Zoom camera with him. He would be fired. So he took leave for a while, but then, like so many people that we're seeing, he ran out of leave. So we helped him negotiate something that actually the employer had never done before, and got him furloughed instead of fired, so he could return to his job after the pandemic. This guy is like most of the callers to our hotline, 70% are low income. But he's unlike most of the callers to our hotline because 83% of the people we're hearing about are mothers. So mothers are not faring well.
Joan, we're a little tight on time. Can you concisely just summarize for us the work on diversity that you do, diversity and inclusion? Why haven't we made more progress? To ask you to say that in a concise way, I'm sure is a nightmare. But could you concisely, and we'll try to go back to it when we all talk later.
Yeah. Well, bottom line is to address structural racism and sexism, you have to go structural. Having an earnest conversation about how much we all value inclusion, that's not going structural. And so what you need to do is to start from evidence and use goals and metrics. In other words, to use the kinds of tools that businesses use to address any problem they actually care about. And I'll leave it there for now.
I really appreciate that, Joan. And that's such an important segue for Abby. Abby Disney, as we said, you've done this incredible work that's drawn a lot of attention to the plights of workers and this wealth gap. Dive right in, Abby. How did you first learn about, I believe you had a message from a custodian at Disney. Do you want to tell that story, Abby?
Sure. I actually don't really spend any time on Facebook anymore. I'm so mad at them. But I did get a Facebook message. I don't know why I read it. I generally don't read them. But it was from a Disney custodian. And I had read the occasional article. They'd been popping up a lot in 2018 about conditions for workers at Disney. I brushed it aside. I thought, well, I'm sure that's not true. And he asked me to come out and sit with him and his other worker colleagues in the union. And I was pretty appalled by what I heard. And it sort of just locked into my heart. I couldn't really just sit silently by.
Well, I want to get into what you're doing, but I want you're good on metrics. Joan just talked about metrics, and I'm starting to realize the more I've researched this particular program that metrics are everything, right? On the CEO of Disney, if you don't mind using him as an example, let's talk about the pay disparity, could you, or the income disparity compared to others, Abby?
In 2019, Bob Iger took home 1,424 times the pay of his average worker, the median worker, rather. And, you know, when you talk about the median worker at a place like Disney, where there's a swath of very low income hourly workers, shift workers, and then you have a lot of high skilled workers, the median pay relationship to the CEO is one piece of information, but it doesn't tell you how grave the situation is until you look at that ratio to what the lowest paid worker is making. They were, most of them, still on minimum wage, California state minimum wage, when I entered this equation. And it was the problem is that the way workers are treated at the bottom is sort of the yin to the yang of CEO pay. And as I said before, some of it is a lot about narratives, right? And our narrative has been, well, if the CEO makes this much money for you, then that's what he should get paid. My grandfather, when he ran the company, certainly never took home 1,400 times the pay of his median worker. But that was because in 1970, the average CEO pay ratio was 20 times, 20. And now it's over 300 as an average. So, and the only reason they didn't do that then was because nobody would do it. There's no law against it. There were social norms and narratives that prevented them from behaving that way. So we need to get into the question of, first of all, why do we look upon our hourly workers as somehow less than human or less worthy of rights and dignity, same as anyone else? If you have full-time people working for you and you're taking home $66 million, and yet your full-time people are regularly using food pantries to feed their families, something is gravely wrong.
So Abby, you and I talked about this last week, the Business Roundtable. For 22 years, they said the most important thing for the corporation's principal purpose was shareholder return. A year ago, they make this big, bold new statement, just about exactly a year ago. And they say companies should serve not only their shareholders, but also value to their customers, invest in employees, deal fairly with suppliers, and support their communities. How's that worked out for everybody?
Well, so far, and it's only been a year, so far we haven't seen much of anything result from that. So I'm still waiting on the big news. But I will say that there are a lot of people saying the right things. There was this an op-ed by Paul Tudor Jones and Dan Schulman from PayPal last week that was really important. Dan Schulman did an economic stress test on every employee at PayPal so that he could figure out which of his employees were in trouble and why economically. I mean, I can't even imagine if Disney did a stress test, financial stress test for all their employees. They would clearly see very, very clear just how stressed their workers are, just the kind of razor's edge that they live on. So that is some serious taking responsibility for the people who work for you and expressing loyalty. So we'll see as time goes on. The Business Roundtable has historically been right behind Milton Friedman and right behind everyone else in thinking about business. And it'll take a long time to turn this Titanic. I lost you, Kyle.
Kyle,
You can't hear me?
you're on mute.
You can't. I'm
gotcha.
not supposed to. Do you hear me now?
I got you now. Now I hear
Okay.
you.
All right, guys. So Abby, really quickly, the Patriotic Millionaires Club, I want to stay close to our time so we have time to all talk in a bit. The Patriotic Millionaires Club, do you want to describe it and whether it's effective and what you're trying to do through that club?
Well, we're a bunch of like-minded people who are well-resourced and consider ourselves very lucky, and also consider ourselves not to have been asked by our country or our society to pay our fair share into the economy. In fact, when we went to war in Iraq, Bush gave us a tax cut. When Donald Trump took office, he gave us a tax cut. No one was asking for that tax cut. There was nothing on this earth to indicate that that tax cut was necessary. And here we stand with a widening deficit and debt. So we deliberately named ourselves something super obnoxious so you wouldn't forget who we were. And we like to use the fact that it's counterintuitive for us to say what we're saying, but basically what we're saying is tax us more.
And finally, Abby, I just have to ask you, because you produced and actually directed one of them, two films that I think are just brilliant, and I recommend to our audience. The first was Pray the Devil Back to Hell. It had a huge influence on me when we were creating Women in the World, and Abby knows that. The other, and that's set in Liberia, African women of Liberia coming together across faiths to create peace in a terrible civil war. Your more recent movie is set in America more recently, and you followed an evangelical preacher who had an epiphany and realized he had to fight the NRA and the gun violence. I have to tell you, Abby, that the first movie set in Africa gave me hope. The movie set in America recently did not. We don't have much time here, but do you have that feeling? I mean, what do you want to say about the contrast between those two films?
Well, watching these virulent pro-lifers explain to me why they needed to have a gun and why they had a right to shoot anybody down if they were taking the car stereo was very discouraging. But I will tell you this. We tried to use that film to take the conversation about guns up to a level above politics, because we stopped choosing to inhabit the space that is above politics. And there's plenty of that. When we speak in a moral tone and ethical tone, we draw an entirely different set of rationales and logic from people. So that was what we did. We made progress. We've gotten into seminaries and theological colleges across the country. We've been shown in all kinds of different evangelical churches. And we are seeing some of the numbers start to turn. Tiny, tiny, tiny baby steps. But, you know, this is a deep hole we've dug in this country. It will take us a long time to dig our way out of it. But I have faith in people of faith, frankly.
Well, I hope we can get back to that when we all talk. Linda Darling-Hammond, once this pandemic is behind us, we know that inequality in education is still going to be one of the great issues of our time. And of course, I think it's coming home to us even more because of the pandemic. We just heard from Abby on inequality. How is the growing wealth gap, Linda, reflected in what you're doing? And can we really fix education in any meaningful way without first addressing the wealth gap? I throw it to you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, Abby was talking about how different it was in the 70s, and we were in college at Yale in the late 60s and early 70s when it was a very different climate. There had been a very substantial war on poverty, the Great Society movement. We cut childhood poverty by half in the 1960s. We cut the Black-white student achievement gap by more than half in the 60s and 70s from a variety of programs that invested in more equity in education. And it has been growing. All of those policies were pretty much wiped out in the 1980s, and the wealth gap has been growing since. The gap between schools has been growing as well. In this country, we not only have this very wide income gap, and we have severe childhood poverty that is growing worse. Homelessness for children is growing worse. Food insecurity, healthcare insecurity. We have a very tattered safety net that has been disassembled in these decades. On top of that, we then fund our schools inequitably. So the top spending states spend 3 times as much as the bottom spending states. Within states, you've got districts spending 3-4 times as much as the bottom spending districts. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer in terms of the quality of education. And that, of course, then leads to an inequitable distribution of qualified teachers, because we have huge teacher shortages in high-need schools. Those people often leave at a very rapid rate, so you have instability. You have an unequal access to curriculum, and then you have, very dysfunctional schools at the top of that. So we've gotten to this place, by failing to address many of these equity issues. Now, there are lots of efforts going on to address them. Every state has its state flag, its state bird, and its state school finance lawsuit, which is trying to get at the structural racism that Joan was talking about and the structural inequality that brings. I have been an expert witness in many of those lawsuits, and welcomed the fact that we had one in California, which has allowed us to change our funding system to a much more progressive approach. But we're going to have to both deal with the issue of resources for schools, the wraparound services that children need, the health care and the mental health care and all of that is also important in those schools. So many of us are working on community school models that provide those services along with education. And then we've got to invest in our educator workforce. Successful industrialized countries, make teaching an attractive profession. They bring people in, as Finland does, into very, very high quality preparation programs. It's like almost a medical model of training for Finnish teachers, a 5-year degree that they get. And then all kids get those kinds of teachers. And then you can enable them to support the kind of social emotional learning and academic learning that's needed to be really successful. If we don't do this in this country, we cannot sustain a role as a first world power. There's just no way around it. We have to really be able to make those investments to succeed in an economy like the knowledge-based economy that we have today.
Linda, I'm going to ask you something that I mentioned to you offline a few days ago about my experiences when I came to Washington, D.C. And the notion that whether someone was on the right or the left, if they were a political leader or really any kind of leader in Washington, D.C., their kids went to private schools. All of their kids, no matter what their political, how they felt about education. And these people would say they cared passionately about public education, but most of their kids went to Sidwell, Murray, St. Albans. And my point is how invested is somebody who says they care about public education if their kid is in Sidwell getting truly a top education, and up in other parts of the city there are kids literally wearing down coats because they're so cold because the school has no heat? Can you inspire these people to make this issue urgent when it's not urgent in their own lives?
I think it's a great question. Now, among those people in Washington, D.C. are the ones who are sending their kids to school in Montgomery County and Fairfax County, as well as the ones sending their kids to private schools. These are well-heeled, well-funded public school systems. And that's part of the issue here, is how do you get to the kind of funding structure and leadership in those districts. Montgomery County has become much more diverse over the years. They've had leadership that's really taken an equity framework on that. They've really improved the quality of education in the down county schools where my own kids went some years ago. That you can see how a public education system works. But it is important for people to really know the schools in which for which they're making policy. And we do see places that have really turned around public education. Massachusetts, Vermont, New Jersey is a great story. New Jersey is a majority minority state that had very unequal schools for a long time. Finally, Trustee Todd Whitman was the governor, stepped up, and after 30 years of lawsuits, put the money into the schools. They put in place early childhood education, they put in place all the teacher training, and now they are one of the top 2 ranked states in the country. Although they have a high poverty population, mostly students of color, they're ranked either number 1 or number 2 on every indicator of educational achievement, graduation, because they made that investment, which is the investment that we need to see being made, in every part of the country.
I hope we'll get back to this, Linda, when we all talk in a bit about how you actually foment, how you take these examples, and I want to go to Katie next, and scale up and really and inspire others to look at Trustee Todd Whitman's model and the others. Kate Walsh, I want to go on to you now. Can you describe for me how the Boston Medical Center views health equity? How are you advancing health equity as a healthcare provider and more broadly as an organization and also as an employer, which is an interesting part of your task?
A really big part of our task. Thanks, Kyle. So, we think of health equity as the absence of avoidable, unfair, and remediable differences in health outcomes. And it sounds very simple in the year 2020 in a city like Boston, but it's really not. Even in Boston, where, we've had universal access before the rest of the country had the Affordable Care Act in Massachusetts, so access is not an issue. But Black infant mortality is still 4 times that of white people in the city of Boston. The Black community has higher incidence of diabetes, 3 times the incidence of type 2 diabetes, and almost 2 times the incidence of hypertension. Black residents are 6 times more likely to be homeless, 1.5 times more likely to have persistent mental illness or depression, 2 times their suicide rate. So sorry to be a downer, but the facts matter, and the facts are that we have significant racial inequities in healthcare outcomes in a city like Boston. And BMC's been taking care of patients like that for decades. So where have we gone wrong? And I think there's kind of like 4 things that drive it. One is, where patients come from and what's wrong with them. People come in with poverty, with pre-existing conditions, and then the healthcare system. We have biases in how we take care of people, and they're kind of ingrained in what we do. We don't expect a lot of our patients. One of our VP for mission at our hospital says, we really have to expect more of our patients, and then we do things that are fundamentally racist. Black medical students get stopped on their way into the hospital because, quote, they don't look like they're a doctor. And those kind of microaggressions persist. It happens to our patients, and then we're shocked they've got psychiatric illness as a result of what's happened to them. And so what we're really trying to do is step back as an organization. And when I was listening to all the speakers ahead of me, I was thinking, yeah, that's right, because we have to look at what we do ourselves. We have to look at what we know. We create new knowledge in everything, but we don't necessarily study how racism and inequity affect people's healthcare outcomes. And we need to move from beyond studying it to actually do something about it. So in our place, we're looking at like high inequity programs, things like sickle cell disease. We take really good care of kids with sickle cell, but when they are an adult, we see them as drug seeking, so there's lots of work that we can do in that space. There's so much work we can do as an employer. We had 800 patients we employ about 6,000 people, 800 people have diabetes. So if our workforce looks like our patients, what are we doing as an employer in terms of even our own benefits design and what we pay for benefits and what we support to help people? And then finally, research, education, and advocacy. How do we bottle this moment in time where I think many like-minded people in this country are saying this has to stop? And how can we better serve the people that we're trying to take care of? So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think about the fact that we talk to our board every single meeting our finances. I think I need to have the same diligence about talking to them about both where the steps we're taking to address health inequity and frankly where we're falling short. And I think, it's kind of inspect what you expect. So as an organization, that's what we're trying to do. Sorry,
Kate, we're really tight on time, but I do want you've got it. We obviously have to ask you about the pandemic, how it is for all of you responding again as a treatment center, but also as an employer, and also how you're preparing for what we're being told will be a second surge. Can you keep it tight and give us some, I hate to ask you that.
But I will try. So it's, obviously, the biggest challenge in COVID was asking people to do things that put themselves and their families at risk. And particularly early on in the pandemic, when testing was really slow and we didn't have adequate access to personal protective equipment, it was a very difficult conversation. And people suited up literally and figuratively in just a magnificent way. And they found ways to reduce the impacts on their patients for isolation and, using all kinds of, we had nurses who printed pictures of family members, and I could go on. And the community response was fantastic. Going into the second surge, we are better prepared as a country because we have personal protective equipment and testing has improved. I think the big issue we're going to have in this country is how to distribute vaccines. Think for a moment that vaccines have to be in -80 freezers, and think about something as sexy as cold chain distribution. And you're not going to go to your Walgreens or CVS to get these shots. So how is it going to be done, and how is it going to be distributed equitably?
Kate, really tightly, and this is a really brutal thing to do to you, because I want to ask you about the ACA case about to be brought before the Supreme Court. We all know what's going on this week with a possible new nominee. What's at stake with that ACA case before the Supremes, which will be in November, I believe.
Yeah, I can't imagine if the ACA is reversed. I mean, the ACA has saved lives. There are multiple studies to prove that. I don't think this country becomes as great as it wants to be by taking away health insurance from 32 million Americans who are working but not insured. It's to me, it's just stunningly flawed public policy, and I kind of don't have words.
I'm going to bring you all back very quickly, but first we have to go to Krishanti. I've told you all about Krishanti Vignarajah. Krishanti, how many times, you and I talked about this last week, we've heard the words of Gandhi, that the greatness of a nation is measured by how it treats its weakest. You and I are both saying you can't really call somebody weak. And first, I do want to make sure Krishanti hears me. Krish, do you hear me?
I can.
Good. You cannot call someone weak who has made his way to our country or her way to our country with their families to get safe, to get fed, to be free, to build a life. So when we talk about the way we're treating refugees and detainees, it's the most revealing proof, I think you would agree, of our nation's retreat from its motto at the base of the Statue of Liberty. So paint a picture for us, Krish, if you would, about what's happening to refugees and detainees, beginning with this horrific story on the hysterectomies, and I'll let you, and the children, all of it. It just every day there's another story.
Yeah, and like Kate, I don't want to be a downer, but the truth is, it's horrific. The reports of mass hysterectomies, especially given their connection to the U.S.'s, horrendous history of sterilization of minorities, it's not unique. We already have several women who have come forward with reports of receiving unwanted gynecological procedures. But this is part of a long line of problems, right? We have seen countless reports of unsanitary conditions, the use of harmful chemicals that are causing bleeding, pain. When we talk about family separation, obviously we had the crisis 2 summers ago, but even today we have a variant on that because children are being held in family detention. As of July, there was a federal judge that ordered them to be released, but ICE chose not to release their parents as well. And so the parents face an impossible choice of either releasing and separating from their child or keeping their child in detention during a pandemic. So those are the kinds of conditions that we're still seeing today.
Krish, I'm going to diverge from something and just ask you about the importance of legal representation. I know that there's the Becca Heller, who went to Yale Law, created that incredible project out of Yale Law to help refugees. And when they started having the issues in early February of 17, refugees coming in, being detained at the airports, she raced to the airports and they went to all the courts. I have to believe that legal representation, urgent legal representation, is critical, isn't it?
It is. I mean, what we find is that it is a game changer, whether it is allowing children who are at the southern border, who are exercising a legal right, particularly those children who are fleeing human trafficking. But if they don't know, because of course they don't have the legal knowledge that they need to push back and that they have a legal right to cross the border, they are one of those thousands of children who are summarily expelled. Likewise, in terms of access right now here in the country, we know that it is the difference between an individual being deported and actually getting due process.
We have to ask you, because you ran for governor of Maryland, congratulations for running. You're an example to us all. What did that experience teach you about inequality, Krish? What lesson did you learn that you've applied to your work now with refugees?
Yeah, well, it was fun to be called Donald Trump's worst nightmare in a couple articles as I was running, and I think it was because I was a mom, a minority, a woman, an immigrant. It was a really interesting experience for me in terms of what is the inequality you feel as a woman in politics. I was the only woman running, and I was a new mom, and I owned my candidacy as a new mom. So I actually launched my campaign on my daughter's 3rd-month birthday, and the first policy I announced was that I wanted Maryland to be the first state of the nation to guarantee 3 months of paid family leave. But, it was the inequality of every day. I got the questions about how could I balance running for office and having a newborn, even though my husband, who's the CEO of a national nonprofit, never got that question. It was the inequality of walking into a room as a woman of color who's 5'2" and never having kind of the benefit of the doubt. I remember talking to Senator Mikulski, and she said to me, look, you're going to get what people say, they said to me, which is, you don't look the part. And you respond and say, well, this is what the part looks like. So I tried to have fun with it. It was even the inequality of being the target of trolls. So I made a mean tweets video of that. But in seriousness, I think that the most difficult challenge was the fundraising, especially in statewide office. Fundraising is king. And unfortunately, still today, it is very difficult for a woman to run and raise money. It's also just in part because women don't donate as much. We have, 2/3 to 3/4 of men who represent donations over $200. About a quarter of women donate in those amounts. And so part of, I think, my plea is, please, if you're a woman, if you have any means, donate to women who are running, because it's never easy and it is such a decisive factor.
So, Krish, you and I talked last week also about the running theme here, but with every single one of you experts, this is one common thread, which is the yearning to get our country back to caring about someone who is considered to be the other, caring about the other. My question to all of you, we kind of got into a dust-up about it last week. I think I'll start with maybe Abby and then Joan, is how here's what we know. Confirmation bias, we're told, tells us that facts don't change minds. I don't know what this is about, but that facts don't change minds. So, Abby, how do you change minds around getting the wealthy to care about those who are sleeping in their cars even though they're working for them? Abby, do you hear me? And do you want to kick off? And then I'm going to have
I can hear you. Am I coming in clearly?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, because I'm having a wobbly internet right now, so stop me if I start to cut out. But
go ahead.
It's really important to exercise our critical faculties when we look at the things that we see on the television and the internet and so forth. And I would remind everybody, I don't know a lot of people 30 and under who are falling for QAnon hoaxes and other crazy stories on the internet. Part of this is a generational issue. The older people who are not tech fluent are the people who are going down the really stupid rabbit holes. So part of the problem of disinformation and this kind of thing will a little bit solve itself as younger people with more tech savvy come more and more online. So, and the facts are not the issue. The facts are not the issue. The narrative is the issue. And the narrative has nothing to do with the facts. The narrative is how you believe the world to work and what you feel is real and what you feel is not real. and has nothing to do with any information you might or might not have access to. So people who are religious have a narrative about how if you behave well, you're going to have a nice afterlife and all of this kind of thing. So this is about, we need to talk to people's narratives. Film is one of the most important ways of doing that. Film takes people, if you just remember, and I miss this so much, the last time you were in a theater in the dark with a bunch of strangers, and it was a really good film, and you kind of forgot who you were. Have you had that happen? Everybody's had that happen at one time or another. That is when you get into people's narratives. That is the opportunity you have. They're wide open in this moment. And how you use the film to feed that wide openness with something better and more positive can really change the world. And what Hollywood is currently doing with that opportunity is awful. But there are a lot of people working hard to offer content and narratives that really, in fact, do. So we need to promote the better narratives. We need to, frankly, punish Hollywood for feeding us full of negativity and violence by not giving them our money when they do that.
Joan, I'm sorry, go ahead, Abby.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask Joan if you agree with that it's not about the facts as much as it is the narrative and this, how people, the reality question, the different realities going on. Joan, do you hear me?
I mean, I think the bottom line is watch Abby's movies. That is one thing. But I do think also it's situational because for example, in the diversity and inclusion space, I think that if you provide a very vivid description on the ground, and Krish just did, some groups have to prove themselves more than others. That's what you found, right? And women are unlikable if they have their resting bitch face, which means their face. Another, you also talked about maternal wall discrimination. And I think what I have found is that if you describe these things on the ground and give them catchy names and talk to people from evidence, and people look around at their colleagues and go, yeah, that kind of happens. And then you can say to people, okay, how can we work on this, not just symbolically, having another deep conversation about how we all value diversity. I always say, if a company had a problem with sales, they wouldn't declare National Celebrate Sales Month and move on. It's like, oh, well, it was impossible to raise sales. That's basically what they've done in the diversity and inclusion context. But if you give them that fine-grained description that Chris started to give us, and say, here are some concrete tools, and this is the effect that they make. And I'll just give one example. We gave people like a 2-page document that described how gender and racial bias play out in performance evaluations. Just reading them through it led to 40% higher bonuses for Black women, Black men, and white women, and significantly higher bonuses for all those groups. We haven't accomplished anything because we actually haven't tried.
Wow. See, I think the organizers are going to kill me for this. I think we need to do a follow-up, even if it's about these solutions you're all proposing. There's so much here. I will, to our audience watching, we'll put something online when we figure out how we're going to have another conversation around these amazing solutions. And that's one, Joan, that I just think is fascinating, that immediate impact came out of that survey. I do want to leap over to Linda Hammond. Linda, it's sort of back to what I was asking you before. Can you hear me, Linda?
I can.
About how you foment change. Is it data? You actually are citing these examples. It's sort of what I was bringing up before. You mentioned New Jersey doing such good work. Why is that not being replicated, or is it? I mean, how do we definitely have too many children fighting to be educated in this country. And how do you foment the change?
Well, we do have some, states learning from other states. I mean, it depends on what the leadership is in the state. I mean, a lot of it is political power, and we're all working on political issues, I think, in one way or another, especially right now. Some of it is national leadership. When we've had progressive national leadership, There have been ways to encourage and leverage these kinds of changes in the state. Some of it is litigation, thank goodness for, the lawyers who are out there, litigating on equity issues all of the time. And so we've got to come at it from multiple angles. But somebody earlier on was talking about sort of how otherizing takes place, how people think about, those are other people's children.
Yes.
And that's partly exacerbated by the degree of segregation that we have, which has also grown since the 70s significantly. There were a set of policies that were in place that reduced segregation for a period of time. Those, again, were taken away. We need to re-engage those policies around housing as well as education, and bringing people together in places where they can't think of what happens to some other person's child as irrelevant to what happens, for their own child. So that's a big piece of it as well, is that frame of mind. The other thing is that, of course, in a society like the one we have today, if we don't educate all kids well so that they can pay get good wages, pay good taxes, my Social Security and your healthcare benefits will not be supportable. Right. Because too many people will be on the side of the equation where they are unable to gain employment, unable to be part of the economy, part of the school to prison pipeline. So there's a self-interest piece of this that hasn't been articulated. I think, obviously we should make education wonderful and equal for moral and ethical reasons, but there's also a self-interest piece of this, which is that everyone's well-being is reduced if we don't have a very highly educated population across the board.
All right, listen, guys, we're very, very tight on time, and as we know, it's there's a jam-packed. We could go forever. I do. Kate, could you, in 15 seconds, don't you think that your entire model is the model that needs to be replicated if we're fomenting change?
Yeah, I'd love to think that, but I think the most important thing we can do is partner. Like this panel has shown, these are multifaceted problems, and I think we get at it through partnership. We can take really good care of kids through an episode of illness, but if they're not learning in school, their lives won't improve. And so it really is working together. So it's been an honor to be here. Thank you.
Krishanti, could you give me 30 seconds on that, and then give me what you want the audience to do? First of all, wrap up this conversation in 30 seconds, Krishanti, and then I'd like you to tell me, what do you want this audience to do on refugees when we hang up? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I do think that the most important thing that does connect all of us is not just the otherness, but the dehumanization. Because in our space, it's the use of language like illegal alien or, unaccompanied alien child, which is actually a term that is used. I think it's a lot easier to put a kid in a cage if you don't view them as a human being. And I think it's really important for me every time I have a seat at the table, especially as the only female CEO of one of the resettlement agencies, to explain that these children need to be treated as we would any of our children. In terms of what I'd ask the audience to do, my top 3 would be vote. Make sure everyone votes. And if you have an ability to participate in voter protection, be a part of that. Otherwise, I think that one of the most important things that we work on is the power of the purse. Right now, part of why you see the mass incarceration of brown and black people is because of private prisons. If institutions dry up their financing, I do think that is going to be a key part. If states say we're not going to have ICE detention centers run by for-profits in their states, that is how we will shut it down. And then just help us give voice to the voiceless. These are the individuals who are hiding in the shadows because of these inhumane policies. But anything you can do to fight the fear-mongering and to replace, fiction with fact is what we would ask.
Brilliant. A lot there. It's sort of sad and tragic in a way that we have to tell people to stop dehumanizing others, that we've come to that, but here we are. Kate, we've got about 35 seconds from you to tell this audience, they get off this call, what do they do for you, for help, for what your mission is?
Vote's really important. I think I think we have to really address the financing of how we pay for healthcare in this country. We have to wrestle with the fact, is it a right or is it an industry? And I think that there's lots of jobs tied up in health. It's almost 20% of the GDP, but figuring out the balance between what we need to do for people and what we like to do for people, which is often not the same thing. I'm struck in COVID that with all the technology we have and all the medicines we have, the most effective thing we can do is wear a mask.
Good advice.
All right, Kate, that's what you can do. Thank you, Kate. Great visuals, Kate, by the way. We thank you. Linda, who wanted visuals. Linda, you wanted visuals. We apologize we weren't able to do them in this one. We're going to do that sometime, I promise. Linda, what can the audience do for your mission for education?
Well, I want to co-sign everything that Krish said and everything that Kate said, and not only wear a mask because we're trying to get to safe schools in California and elsewhere, but also wash your hands for 20 seconds and do all the other things that are necessary. But I also want to just say, each of us gave an example in different fields of how you can make a difference. So we need to put our bucket down where we are and think about, whether it's making movies, fixing healthcare, dealing with, immigration, all of these pieces, the legal side of it. We all have to put our bucket down where we are and think about what is it that we can do in our organizations and our roles to make a difference towards a more equitable future and present, hopefully a very near-term present in this country. And we also need to collaborate in the ways that we've been describing. They say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And we have to really join hands across all of these areas to get to the society that we want to create.
And thank you, Abby. Before you talk, I just want to say, I think your dog was saying, don't forget equal rights for pets. Don't you think? That was Abby, it's your turn. What can your audience do for the missions you care about?
Well, first, I want us to notice that underlying every one of the social problems, even though they seem they're varied, underlying every one of these problems is a sort of learned callousness about other human beings. Right. People made that problem, and therefore people can fix it. Yep. So don't despair about your fellow human beings because they got us here. Pay attention to how to get us out of here. And my advice is figure out what you're good at. You might be good at 6 things. You might be good at just 1. And figure out how that will feed the world. And then go do that until you can't do it anymore.
Brilliant. Joan, would you mind doing it in 35 seconds, telling the audience what they can do?
Don't squander this racial moment. White people are finally realizing that racism is structural. So is sexism. To address it in your organizations, you have to go structural. A earnest conversation is not going to work. And so go to www.biasinterrupters.org and use the tools for your organization. Let me give you just one other example. We were doing an experiment with one company and found that only 9.5% of the people of color had leadership mentioned in their performance evaluations. So we redesigned the form. We gave them a simple training. The next year, 100% of people of color had leadership mentioned in their performance evaluations, which correlates tightly in that organization with promotion. Don't settle for less. Let's not squander this moment, please.
Thank you so much. I got to tell you guys, I am not going to do any kind of wrap up. You just wrap this up. I want all of your recommendations to ring in the ears of our audience and to promise somehow we're going to follow on. we just started scratching the surface of the most important and urgent issue of our time. Thank you so much. I talked about the bios being both humbling and inspiring when we read them about each of you. I am both humbled and inspired by all of you. We will continue this. We have to continue this. We're honored to have had all of you. And on behalf of Yale, you are our pride. Thank you so much. Bye.